Hi, I am Brian Sykes from Cornell University, and I have the privilege of introducing our next panel titled Abolition as Policy. This panel has a number of everyone doing fantastic work in this area. First is Monica Bell, professor of law and an associate professor of sociology at Yale University. Next is Faith Deckard, a doctoral candidate in sociology at UT Austin and an incoming assistant professor of sociology at UCLA. Next, we have Susila Guruswamy, an assistant professor of criminology, law, and justice at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And then last but certainly not least is DeMarcus Jenkins, assistant professor of social policy at the University of Pennsylvania.
So I want to quickly say a couple of words, just thanking everyone who brought us together. It's so wonderful to be here among friends, new friends, old friends who are working on these important issues, and it's really humbling to be a part of this community. Second, I want to quickly say a word about some of my research before moving into more squarely into the policy conversation. For the last, I think, about 12 years, now it's more than a decade, it's making me feel really old. I've been working on issues, basically conducting qualitative research in Black neighborhoods, with Black people, talking about their experiences, not just with the police, but with the legal systems, interlocking legal systems writ large. And that's really important because my orientation toward this research is not so much about what we do with the criminal system. It's instead about how all of these systems fit together in the larger story of what I've referred to in my research as legal estrangement. I'll say a little bit more of a word about what that means momentarily. So some of that research has been participatory research in Baltimore, Maryland. I've also done research in DC, which is where I was a legal aid attorney before going to grad school. About mothers and how they kind of navigated this complex relationship between policing and social systems. Some of what I'm going to talk about relates to some more recent projects I've been involved with some larger ones. So one is a project that I was working on with Catherine Beckett and Forrest Stewart between 2020 and 2022 related to LEAD in Seattle, which at the beginning of that time was called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, has had a number of different iterations over the last several years. And I think that that program speaks to what I'm going to talk about in a minute about the kind of complexity of moving between kind of from here to there and what the there is. And then fourth, I want to briefly talk about so some work I was involved with the NYU Policing Project, which has focused on alternative emergency response. So alternatives to 911, some of what Heather briefly mentioned in her comments during the last panel, and say a little bit more about some of the nuts and bolts and tricky pieces of a lot of these alternatives and kind of, again, policies that try to move us from here to there. So in terms of my theoretical orientation, the big kind of both question and theoretical commitment of my research has been this idea that I've referred to as legal estrangement. And the key move, in my opinion at least, is that it tries to turn the lens from why people and groups don't trust or are cynical about police and institutions of public safety, so to speak, and welfare, and instead to look at how these institutions exclude or estrange groups from their rightful claim over the state, which changes the nature of the interpretation of data, I think. So it's like, instead of what do we do to make this institution, to kind of convince people to trust this institution? Instead, the question is, how do we make this institution less exclusionary, which is not assuming that trust is the goal and is kind of taking seriously the sense and reality of social exclusion that emerges from how we make legal and institutional arrangements. And So that's the key sort of move. Now, one of the reasons I'm presenting without slides and focusing mostly on the policies is because I'm a legal scholar. So like I said, I teach at a law school, and so one of the things that's really important in the legal scholarship world is to think seriously about prescriptions and the politics of them. So what I want to do is highlight three solutions that. And I don't want to call them solutions because they're not really solutions. They're just mechanisms that people have proposed to get us from here to there in the kind of policy world. And so first is what I've already alluded to, which is this alternative emergency response. So a lot of these models kind of kicked off in 2020 in the post-murder of George Floyd era, modeled on cahoots in Oregon, which, as we know, is probably a lot of you who are watching already know, is a program that basically has people who are not police respond to people in mental health crises. And so there's kind of an alternative number you would call or something like that. Now, one of the things that's really important is that a lot of the models that have been used around the country in these pilot programs are very, very different from each other. And these very different types of models have real serious implications for how they would actually work. So, for example, in one of the places where the research is taking place, and I want to highlight here particularly the work of Jessica Galluli, who's a researcher who is focused on the police decision makers in these models. So one question is, how many hours of the day is this program available? Why is this important? Like really nuts and bolts, but really important for understanding the true availability of an alternative. If someone has a mental health crisis late at night, then the police come then, and not these alternative responders. That's a real serious implication for how we can even understand the potential efficacy of a policy like this. Another example is, what is the mechanism when calls arrive? So is there a separate number, or are numbers being called, do they call 911 and then on the basis of some kind of decision-making tree, the call goes to kind of a couple of workers who are tasked with dispatching the social service people instead of the police. This has really serious implications for that first person who's on the decision tree has a lot of power in determining whether an alternative response even actually occurs. And these are the types of nuts and bolts things we need to look at. The biggest one, actually, in my opinion at least, is what's the trigger for when a police officer has to be involved. Has to is really loaded language, but we're going to go with it because this is how a lot of these pilots actually work. So the idea is that if there's not a danger there, like if there's no weapon, then you would route the person to this alternative. But if there's some kind of potential risk involved for the social workers, and how risk is defined is very broad, then there might need to be a police officer there, and you don't really get the meaningful alternative response. Why is this important? Well, I have in my mind very much this morning when Rosario, who is a young man who is having a health crisis in New York City, where I live, and the NYPD shows up after his mother calls because he's in mental health crisis. And somehow there's a very disputed set of events. But at the end, what they can agree on is that when Rosario had scissors, and these scissors were deemed threatening enough by the NYPD to ultimately kill him in that moment while he was being held by his mother. Now, so we hear that, and so like an easy response if you're in the kind of emergency, the alternative response world would be, well, why were police there? Why weren't there social workers there, or something like that? What else could have been there? Sure. But the question is, are scissors a weapon? Like, how do we think about scissors? This is a really, really nuts and bolts question that has real implications for the efficacy of this policy. Now I realize after I said I'm not going to take 15 minutes, I'm at risk of breezing past that. Okay, so anyway, we're still on number one, but number two. Interventions like LEAD that directly tackle what some people call behavioral health, but what I might prefer to call something like human suffering on the street, something like that, something that's more like recognizing of what's really happening. Programs like this are really important for the politics of public safety. So this is a point that I wanted to make sure to get to, because I can't live, like I have to live in the real world. And one of the things I've learned about the real world right now is that we are operating in a culture that is deeply antithetical to abolitionist practice. Even like just a quick example that is probably too fun given how little time I have left, but how many of you like the movie American Fiction or saw the movie American Fiction? People love this movie, but one of the things that I noted about it is there's a couple of scenes where defund and abolition are mentioned, and they're mentioned specifically as a joke. Like that there is a Brooklyn-based white woman who is like, defund abolition, you just don't know enough about it. And then the black person is like, what are you talking about? This is a joke, which made it harder for me to like the movie. But one of the things is, but it reflects something so deep about one of the serious challenges we have in even having this conversation, which is there's a lot of realism to the actual practical world of doing abolitionist, both organizing and policymaking. But that's not understood in our political discourse. And that's a real problem. So I think one of the questions we have to confront in conversations about abolitionist policy is the moving from here to there and taking seriously liminal policies that might not actually be abolitionist in their orientation. And I think LEAD is actually a really interesting example of this. One of the fascinating things about studying LEAD was how many people involved with the actual doing of LEAD identified as being radical or abolitionists in their hopes and dreams, but confronted with the reality of having to coordinate with different occupational cultures to achieve their goals. So having to work with prosecutors who are like, we need to have a retributivist mindset, or judges who are like, the only way to deter you is to have this backstop of the criminal system. And so there are real questions about how to have an abolitionist politics while working in a program like that where not everyone has those goals. But that's a really serious question, like how much of how much of that is what you need to do to deal with real world problems on the ground versus whether that is, and I'm just kind of sliding into the third point here, whether that is kind of a project of legitimation. So this legitimation is something that abolitionists worry and think about a lot. This idea that you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. But there's a second part of that Audre Lorde quote where she also says, there might be some temporary wins that can come from that. And so what I want to propose today is that we actually need a structure by which we are engaged in projects that achieve temporary wins while also keeping our eye on the arc of abolition, and there has to be serious conversation and coordination around working along all those poles, but the politics of that are really hard. In my less than 2 minutes, another piece I wanted to highlight of this, I don't have enough time to talk about structural reform litigation, but it kind of is operating from the same idea, which is that structural reform litigation, so pursuing consent decrees on both the state and federal level to deal with the police departments, seems really reformist in its orientation. However, there are things that you can insert in consent decrees that could chip away at the power of police departments and change the nature of the kind of segregated world in which police are operating and build the capacity for alternatives like real serious mental health response. So those are some examples. And then finally, I just wanted to say a word, and this is harkening back to a theme we got to in the previous session, but I just wanted to draw it out a little bit more. This is a key part of the story. Process is actually the absolute most important. It's the key variable in how we think about whether a policy or practice is abolitionist or not. So we can engage in an ostensibly abolitionist project that does not do that democratic work that Heather was talking about. And that's a problem because the very concept of abolition is about liberation and democracy and power for people who have not had it. And so if people in a room like this sit on high and say, this is what the policy should be, then we're doing it wrong, actually. We're engaging in a process that is maybe not carceral, but it's certainly pulling away from the kind of broader goals of democracy that we're even talking about in the first place. So those are some of the provocations I wanted to offer, but thank you so much for letting me be here. Where are you going?
I was going to get my phone so I can track time, but then I was like, that's not going to happen. It's too much to manage.
So, good morning, everyone. As Brian mentioned, my name is Faith, and it is such an honor to be here at this conference, let alone presenting my research. I'm extremely excited about this opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to learning from continuing to learn from everyone. So today, I'll be presenting on commercial bail in the context of abolition, and I think that my work is particularly well suited to spotlight families and uneven burdens within this larger conversation. So each year, upwards of 2 million people are released from jail before their court dates through commercial bail bond agencies, which are just these third-party businesses that bond selected defendants out of jail in exchange for a fee and a co-signed loan agreement. Now, on the one hand, commercial bail is lauded in some circles as an effective pretrial release mechanism, as some studies document a relatively high court attendance rate among defendant clients. On the other hand, the practice is condemned for operating as a monetary sanction that disproportionately extracts resources from low-income communities of color. But yet, few empirical studies have examined the process behind commercial bail's so-called effectiveness, right, or success. And few have also examined how the people intimately involved navigate and experience bond and its aftermath. So, drawing on 12 months of ethnographic observation across 3 bail bond agencies in Harris County, and then interviews with 94 bail agents, defendants, and co-signing family members, I find that commercial bail's success, it cannot be understood without acknowledging the shadow system that they have devised, wherein co-signing family members are actually doing that unpaid labor of supervising their defendant kin and getting them to appear in court. Now, through imposing the co-signed loan arrangement, through doling out what I call carceral and financial threats, and through massive emotional manipulation, bail agents can effectively responsibilize families, right, everyday ordinary citizens, to manage risk. So what this means is that commercial bail not only extracts financial resources from communities that are disproportionately low income and Black and brown, but they're also extracting their labor, their time, their emotional resources, among likely many other factors. And the banger for me, well, all of this is a banger, but to drive it home is, given that criminal legal contact is disproportionately concentrated among Black and Latino men, and women are more likely to provide support in the form of co-signing or otherwise, this is really women of color, low-income women of color, that are most likely to be responsibilized for making commercial bail profitable, for making the pretrial system work, and for managing the problems that arise at home in the meantime. So in this way, my research requires us to focus on the full extent of harm and, in turn, the magnitude of abolition's impact. So if we now transition to the question of, if not commercial bail, then what? We'll find the answers or alternative pretrial systems and realities already exist. In fact, various alternatives have long existed, making commercial bail obsolete or severely limited in at least 12 states. So I'm going to run through 3 really quickly and then end with what my research tells us about these existing alternatives. So one such alternative is the pretrial service agencies, or PSAs, and these are publicly run programs that essentially do the same work as commercial bail bond agencies, but as a condition of non-financial release. So as a result, there is this no 10% service fee to pay up front, there's no cosign loan to tether families financially, and there's this reduced prospect on the back end of asset seizure or debt collection should a defendant skip court. Now, PSAs were initially designed as information gathering centers that aided judges in making informed pretrial decisions. But over time, their function has evolved in some jurisdictions to service provision, right, where they do things like monitor, send court reminders, subsidize transportation, and efforts to increase the likelihood that defendants released on pretrial show up in court. Now, the positives of PSAs is that they do reduce the number of people behind bars pretrial, and they prioritize public safety, but without this intense exacerbation of wealth and race-based discrimination, right? So in some ways, they maintain the pros of commercial bail while eliminating one of its significant harms. A drawback, however, is that their supervisory role can actually create challenges for defendants that may be more restrictive and costly than release via commercial bail. Now, a second existing alternative, I'm not really sure if I'm terming that right, but is bonds financed through courts. And what I mean by that is people pay courts, right, instead of bail agencies, a percentage of that bail amount for a defendant's released. And after all court hearings are attended and that case concludes, most of the deposited money gets returned back to the defendant and their family. And of course, if that court date is missed, the 10% is lost and further payment may be sought out. Now, although this alternative still requires payment that could potentially become non-refundable, it retains the relative affordability of commercial bail. It allows money to be returned eventually to families instead of divested to these third-party companies. And it does not use a cosign loan to link the financial fates of families to this profit objective of bail agents and this larger bail industry, effectively eliminating many but not all of the harms that I detail in my dissertation work. Now, as a final alternative, bail funds are community and volunteer-driven organizations that raise money to post bail on behalf of poor defendants. Now, the funds are ideally revolving in that the people they bond out successfully complete their cases so that that money posted on their behalf gets returned so that it can be used for the next person selected. Bail funds have radical roots, with the earliest taking form or coming into public consciousness during times when segments of society face threats to their civil liberties. And we'll find that the same is true today with bail funds like the Bail Project, right, or the National Bailout Collective, grounding their efforts in goals of race and class equality, liberation, and abolition. Now, while bail funds are these humanistic alternatives that sidestep many of commercial bail's pitfalls, they do have some practical shortcomings. Now, given their revolving model and limited capital, their services are often limited to defendants with misdemeanor charges and relatively low bail amounts, right? So there's a limit on who they can help. And further, their need for high success rates, either to maintain legitimacy or to keep having access to these revolving funds, it may result in high levels of monitoring or imposed requirements that make them susceptible to the same pitfalls as PSAs and commercial bail. So now returning back to my research. A strength, I think, of my research on commercial bail is that it expands our rubric for evaluating both the benefits and the harms of proposed alternatives. So by this I mean, my research makes clear that the harm of commercial bail extends beyond financial extraction, right? It extends beyond economic exclusion to encompass things like relational harm, right, to families, mental and emotional distress, racialized and gendered inclusion, right? When we talk about women of color predominantly burdening this task, but also concentrated burden and responsibility. Additionally, my research emphasizes that harm is extending beyond the person charged with the crime, right? To those who co-sign the bond, but also those who don't, but are just existing within that larger support system. So consequently, commercial bail implores us to center families in our conversations about bail reform and then abolition. and asks not if families are included or impacted, but how, right? So the starting question then becomes, how do PSAs, how do court finance funds, how do bail funds impact families? If payment, right, the consequence we're primed to expect in this setting, is still required in many of the alternatives, then it's likely that families are also bearing many less apparent costs under these alternative models. So it follows that regardless of the type of alternative institution or structure or program, the task of pretrial risk management may again fall back on support system members, especially women of color, burdening them even further in the universe of bail reform. So I think what I'd like to leave you with is, when we think about bail reform and ultimately abolition, studying extreme cases or cases on the opposite end of the spectrum like commercial bail, it keeps us aware of the multifaceted harm to be addressed and the full range of people in need of liberation from oppressive systems. And that's what I have for you all.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm really excited to be talking with all of you about this today. I'm going to be discussing abolitionist responses to what are called gender-responsive strategies or policies, which I argue enable reproductive violence against criminalized women, and particularly so for Black women. So for this presentation, I'm going to show how the state of California weaponized the language, discourse, and policies of women's empowerment and care to illegally sterilize more than 1,000 people incarcerated in its women's prisons between 1997 and 2013, most of whom were Latina and Black, and many of whom did not know and actually still may not be informed that they were sterilized. So this is very well documented in the film Belly of the Beast, and so that's where I'm pulling some of this information from today. One of the key methods for these illegal sterilizations was through the use of what are called bilateral tubal ligations, which is a permanent surgical form of sterilization. There were a series of explosive news stories, state audits, and investigative reports beginning in 2013 that found that California prisons failed to provide proper informed consent when performing these procedures on pregnant incarcerated women, and in many cases, didn't even tell people that they had been sterilized because they'd been told that they were being surgically treated for other conditions. This was corroborated by women I met while doing 18 months of ethnographic fieldwork focused on Black women's experiences at a reentry home in Los Angeles. I was once part of a conversation in which a group of women shared how they avoided seeking medical assistance for vaginal issues while they were incarcerated, unless absolutely necessary, because as one woman remarked, you never know what they're gonna do or what they're gonna take. I learned that that woman was referencing what a 2013 news story later reported, that between 2006 and 2010, 148 pregnant women in California prisons were the target of coercive tubal ligations, and that there were maybe an additional 100 women sterilized dating back to the 1990s. The report notes that prison medical staff focused on coercively sterilizing women who they believed might be reincarcerated in the future. One of the women's prison's OB-GYNs, Dr. James Heinrich, who worked at Valley State Prison, denied coercing anyone into being surgically sterilized. But records show that proper approvals from state officials for the sterilizations was never obtained. And even though he denied coercing pregnant people into being sterilized, Heinrich said, on the record to a reporter, that he viewed these sterilizations as a cost-paying service to taxpayers because, quote, compared to what you save in welfare paying for these unwanted children as they procreated more. Heinrich evokes long-standing eugenicist discourses and practices about criminalized Black women as hypersexual welfare dependents in order to justify sterilizing incarcerated women. And it's important to know that sterilizations like the ones Heinrich had been performing were actually in violation of federal and state financial and anti-coercion regulations. But Valley State officials, or officials at Valley State, initially claimed to not know about those regulations. But documents actually show that in 2005, someone had filed a complaint about the sterilization of a woman who had had at least 6 children, which then prompted prison medical officials to look deeper into the regulations around prison sterilization. But they didn't do this to ensure compliance. They admitted to actually trying to find a way around existing regulations to facilitate more sterilizations at the prison. Dawn Martin, a psychologist and the top Valley State medical manager from 2005 to 2008, told a reporter that she believed pregnant women who were unhoused or struggled with addiction purposefully tried to get incarcerated so they could get medical care. She said on the record to a reporter that, "Do I criticize these women for manipulating the system because they're pregnant? Absolutely not. But I don't think it should happen. And I'd like to find ways to decrease that." Martin and Heinrich had both stated on the record how they conspired to document tubal ligations for women with multiple children as an issue of medical emergency, citing additional pregnancies as a potentially fatal health danger. Martin believed that this potentially allowed them to circumvent legal requirements to gain approvals from state officials in Sacramento for sterilizations. A 2014 state audit that investigated bilateral tubal ligations in California's women's prisons between 2005 and 2013 then documented that all the records they reviewed during those 8 years revealed that proper consent documentation wasn't done, which means that all of the people who received tubal ligations during that time period had their legal reproductive rights violated. The audit also found that it wasn't just women who had been incarcerated multiple times who were the target of tubal ligations, and that most women who were sterilized had actually been incarcerated for the first time. So these data points are part of a larger story of how California prisons developed a sprawling approach to explicitly and intentionally violate the legal reproductive rights of people incarcerated in its women's prisons. So what's really important to note here is that Heinrich and Martin actually claimed that they were working to empower incarcerated women by making sterilizations more readily available to them. Heinrich claimed to be acting in the best interests of women who had had multiple C-sections, saying that additional births could result in potentially fatal blood loss. But this doesn't align with conventional practice recommendations for non-incarcerated people, and reversible birth control options are still considered more appropriate. Martin also claimed to be acting for women's empowerment, indicating that removing sterilization barriers for incarcerated pregnant women was an important part of providing them with the same healthcare options as non-incarcerated women. So both Heinrich and Martin illustrate this particular pattern of reproductive violence that I unpack in my book, in which they knowingly violated the legal reproductive rights of incarcerated women, but framed their efforts as empowerment by drawing on the discourse of what's called gender-responsive carceral policies, in order to claim that their actions were both therapeutic and protective for criminalized pregnant women. So for the rest of my time today, I'm going to talk about how gender-responsive carceral policies and strategies actually function to harm criminalized women, because I argue that they make illegal sterilizations, like the ones I've talked about today, possible. So what are gender-responsive strategies? In the early 2000s, gender-responsive strategies or policies were proposed by a group of sociologists and criminologists as a set of evidence-based, quote, guiding principles and strategies for improving services to women offenders under criminal justice supervision. The foundational claims of gender-responsive strategies are that, quote, women offenders come into criminality differently than men and have unique needs in terms of correctional services. As such, gender-based differences in services should be implemented to manage women offenders more effectively and improve programs and service delivery. Many people see gender-responsive strategies as an important feminist intervention in the male-centric design of the criminal punishment system. Advocates applaud it for recognizing that carceral institutions were designed for men, but now we need carceral institutions that don't just house women, but are actually designed for them. We now see most women's prisons, jails, and reentry institutions in the US and Canada invoke the language and policies of gender responsiveness, and this approach has also rapidly gained global interest. Gender-responsive strategies are often celebrated by feminist criminologists and policymakers for adopting a trauma-informed, holistic approach that also recognizes the importance of cultural differences. Advocates also claim that the implementation of gender-responsive strategies can meaningfully situate carceral institutions to provide women with rehabilitation and essential services, and recognize the importance of criminalized mothers, who are often the primary or sole caretakers of their children before incarceration. Essentially, gender-responsive strategies are framed as a way to see women in an institutional context in which their gendered needs have been historically unmet. But abolition feminists, who have been critiquing gender-responsive strategies for decades as problematic, would argue that these policies see women by flattening and essentializing gender and women's needs, while also contributing to the expansion of carceral power. We can see this unfold when carceral actors like Martin and Heinrich claim to be empowering incarcerated women by sterilizing them against their will and knowledge. They're able to cast their blatant violation of the law and women's reproductive self-determination as therapeutic and protective because of the discourses that gender-responsive strategies make available to them. So, even though I don't think that gender-responsive strategies or policies have made incarcerated women safer, invoking their importance as a commitment to incarcerated women actually obscures this reality as one of reproductive violence. And it distracts us from understanding how historically and contemporarily prisons remain unsafe places for incarcerated women and fail to meaningfully meet their needs. So when we think about how gender-responsive strategies can be used by carceral actors like Heinrich and Martin to advance reproductive violence, I want to draw our attention to some of the language at the core of gender-responsive strategies that should tell us above and beyond what they really are. A strategy to manage incarcerated women. The historical record and present well-documented conditions of sterilization in prisons show us how carceral institutions interpret, quote, managing women offenders through the frames of eugenics, anti-Blackness, and punishing Black women. The sterilization abuses that I've unpacked today, coupled with a long history of using prisons as anti-Black eugenicist tools, exposes how carceral institutions' response to gender is to use it as a vector of racial sexual control and punishment, and not gendered empowerment. So what I urge us to take from this in terms of a policy understanding is how practices that are labeled gender-responsive strategies just obscure, hide, and deflect the ways that carceral institutions punish women, and especially so for Black women. So where do we go from here? First and foremost, I want us to reject gender-responsive strategies and understand them as a false promise of gendered care. We can look to efforts like Black Mama's Bailout, which has been part of the work of National Bailout, with a specific focus on the release of Black mothers as a form of community care and safety. This addresses problems of reproductive violence in prisons and jails by trying to get Black mothers out of jail by raising bail funds that these mothers and those in their direct networks may struggle to access without becoming vulnerable to bondsmen and bounty hunters and the things that the future Professor Deckard highlighted in her work. This fact sheet from the 2019 bailout in Michigan, as organized by Michigan Liberation and the Advancement Project, highlights the material and social gains that come from securing the release of Black mothers in prison. They also highlight how bailout movements are only starting points towards abolitionist efforts, and that the elimination of cash bail altogether is part of the larger vision, which I know other folks here at the symposium are also going to talk more about. We can also take inspiration from recent abolitionist coalition efforts to reject and protest the building of new jails, like the so-called feminist jail in New York City, and instead invest in those things we know actually function as feminist forms of care. Funding for quality housing, childcare, education, and healthcare that are not tied to carceral institutions and surveillance. We're regularly confronted with the urgency of these kinds of refusals. In Illinois, where I live, Governor Pritzker just announced 2 weeks ago that the state is going to spend $900 million to knock down a maximum security men's prison and a women's prison and build new replacement facilities. And advocates of this move claim that this recognizes the humanity and dignity of the people incarcerated in those facilities. But when students incarcerated at Stateville were asked about the use of those funds to build new facilities, one student, Chester McKinney, offered that he would spend $900 million on mental health resources and healthcare resources for marginalized communities. And we should recognize this as part of a broader recognition that the project of building kinder, gentler cages, whether gender responsive or not, proves time and time again to be a human rights disaster. So I'll close by saying, ultimately, investments in gender-responsive strategies make it seem like carceral institutions are capable of rehabilitating themselves as institutions that can help criminalized women, despite demonstrating that this just becomes a shield for abuse, however well-intentioned it may seem at the outset. And would we ever give criminalized people this many opportunities to demonstrate that they could do better? Carceral institutions continue to steal from, rape, and murder incarcerated people, but we keep placing our trust in them and giving them more and more resources to try again. But this stands in direct contradiction to the ways that we treat criminalized people, whose individually caused harms can't compare to the structural damages that prisons, jails, and policing have caused. We've been willing to allow carceral institutions to experiment while lives hang in the balance, while also being told non-carceral approaches to violence and social problems are too risky and experimental to undertake. But if accountability and care is really what we're after, then we have more than enough evidence and resources to shift the resource and energy we pour into carceral institutions into anti-carceral approaches, because health, wellness, and safety are fundamentally incompatible with incarceration. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, or good before noon, I guess it is. My name is DeMarcus Jenkins. I am an assistant professor of social policy and practice at the University of Pennsylvania. My official title is assistant professor, critical race and social policy, because I teach courses on critical theories of race, including critical race theory, Black critical theory, Afro-pessimism, Afrofuturism, and other Black intellectual thought that I think is important, especially in the conversation that we're having today. My research is situated at the intersections of education policy, housing policy, and criminal justice policy. So I enter this conversation really thinking about the forms of incarceration that orbit the schooling environments. So the title of this talk, Police-Free Schools Movement, Policy Change, Discourses, and Black Suffering. I don't think we'll talk much about the Black suffering piece today, but part of what I highlight there is sort of how the processes of abolition, at least in the school context, with the removal of school resource officers, I have argued has contributed to Black suffering and the discourses and the language that are being used and the ways that that has been approached. So love to engage in a conversation about that over lunch or dinner or drinks. Before we get started, though, I want to settle the most important debate of our time. iPhone or Android? iPhone or Android? Raise your hand if you're an iPhone user. Most of us. Android users? Few but mighty. So this is a conversation that really draws my attention for a lot of different reasons. I am an iPhone user, and I love my iPhone for a number of different reasons, but the chief reason why I love my iPhone is its ability to synchronize. I have the iPhone, the iPad, the iPhone, the iPad, the MacBook. I have all these Apple devices, including the Apple Watch, which I absolutely love. For me, these devices collect and leverage large amount of personal data related to what I'm entertained by, my fitness goals, my health goals, and all of this is sort of under the guise of making my life smart or making my life better. These particular devices are enticing to consumers because they are purported to make our lives easier, more convenient, and frankly, they look nice. But I think if we strip away some of the gloss of the Apple Watch and some of these other devices, we can be reminded that they serve the very same functions as devices that are imposed on folks who are formerly incarcerated or immigrants in different ways, right? The iPhone and the Apple Watch allow us an intense devotion to tracking and quantifying all aspects of our waking and non-waking lives. And I think those devices that fall under sorry, I'm on the wrong slide, sorry. So I think one part of what I'm really starting to think about is the relationship between the smartwatch and sort of how this device tracks our movements and provides us this essential data under the guise of making our life easier, but again, serves similar functions to the ankle monitors that formerly incarcerated people are forced to wear for the purposes of predicting and controlling their behavior. There are several frameworks that I think that we can use to understand and consider the implications of our smart devices. Here, I try to think about the concept of luxury surveillance as a way to articulate the type of surveillance that people pay for and whose tracking, monitor, and quantification features are understood by us as benefits that we are likely to celebrate, and in most cases, debate about Apple phone or Android. And we also debate about which phones have the best features, which in a lot of ways is the conversation about features that continue to increase the surveillance that we opt into. In general terms, consumers of luxury surveillance see themselves as powerful and perhaps even immune from unwelcome monitoring and control. We understand quantification and tracking not as disciplinary or coercive necessarily, but as a kind of care or empowerment. We understand these as something smart. I think people who believe that they have nothing to hide willingly submit to surveillance, which we don't necessarily see them as surveillance. We pay more money to opt into this type of surveillance. And in some ways, it puts us into a specialized category, a highly privileged category of a person. I think I also can contrast luxury surveillance with imposed surveillance. And there are different ways that we can think about imposed surveillance. The ankle monitor comes to mind, but there are certainly other forms, especially as we think about what's happening in our school. So here we can see the metal detectors that many schools are using as a way to check students' belongings for weapons. During the height of the pandemic, when students were working from home, there were lots of other sort of software that was emerging to monitor students' activities on the computer. So when they should be working on their computers at home, there were these programs that teachers can see what you're doing and send you a note to say, hey, you're distracted, hey, get back on task. And then, of course, the class cameras, CCTV cameras, and school resource officers. I understand these as forms of imposed surveillance. And for me, whether it's luxury surveillance or imposed surveillance, it all sort of falls under this umbrella or this idea that I'm thinking about as this carceral commitment. And I think as a people, we have become really, in some ways, knowingly or unknowingly, committed to these ideas of being surveilled. Whether we opt into them and we spend lots of money to position ourselves in these sort of highly privileged categories and empowered categories, or whether they're imposed on our bodies unwillingly, there is sort of this, I don't want to call it a desire, but there is this acquiescence to being surveilled. In schools, I can sort of see that carceral commitment playing out in at least 4 different ways. What sociologists call a shared argument as a school discipline superstructure is one of the ways that we see the carceral commitment sort of manifesting in schools. Dakota Urbius really had us think about nets of social control. So the way discipline practices are both widening and deepening as an effort to catch more youth in trouble. So that in order to both widen and deepen these nets of control, surveillance has to tick up. There's also sort of research on hypersurveillance, but I want to sort of pivot a little bit to think specifically around school resource officers or school police, which function and under sort of this umbrella of carceral commitment. But I think in terms of our conversation around abolition and really sort of the policy stance that's been happening in education, school resource officer presents at this point one of the best opportunities for us to really think about abolition in schools. But before turning to that conversation, I just want to highlight a few sort of costs of the carceral commitment as they affect youth in schools. So we know that when youth feel surveilled or feel unsafe, right, they have direct impacts on their ability to pay attention in classrooms, the ability to pay attention in classrooms or concentrate on their academic performance, and even how they are engaged in school functions, right? Students who don't feel safe or feel as though they are restricted are less likely to engage in after-school activities, engage in additional school processes that require them to be at school for longer periods of time. There are also spatial impacts of the carceral commitment. We can think about segregation. I know that I'm doing some work right now on public housing and the federal government's Choice Neighborhood Initiative that's looking at sort of this development of mixed income housing. And a lot of that has meant increased surveillance in these mixed income communities. Some researchers in New York have begun to look at what's called the public housing to prison pipeline, because we know the relationship between those people who are living in public housing and the surveillance that surrounds those developments, and how that leads to more increased opportunities for folks to get in trouble. Which we can also talk about how that then encourages mobility of people to move outside of desired areas for more affluent and resource-rich communities. There's also exclusion, isolation, and just overall withdrawal. So I bring up these impacts or these costs because I think as we start thinking about how policy can be used to redress or address some of these impacts, here's some targeted, very specific ways that I think we can begin to have that conversation. Again, so I think because I work in education primarily, I think about sort of abolition or abolition and policy in the context of school police officers. So I've been doing a lot of research around the police-free schools movement, which depending on sort of how we think about the origins of this movement, we can look at Oakland, which has been one of the districts that have long-standing been calling for the removal of law enforcement officers from schools. But during the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of the conversation around removing police from schools sort of ticked up. Conversation really around sort of how to cut ties with the institution of police around schools. I got the 5-minute mark, so I'm going to move a little quickly through these last bits because I want us to cover some of the ways that I've been thinking about sort of what that means, right? So during the summer of 2020, a lot of school districts decided or started making decisions or considering removing police from schools or cutting ties with police officers. So in my work, I've looked at school board meetings for over 50 districts across the country. And I looked specifically at the school board meetings where that decision to remove police officers was being considered. Each one of the school board meetings had what's called the public comment session, where stakeholders can come and voice their opinions to support or oppose policies under consideration. So I examined all of those public comments across those districts to really try to get a sense of how those who supported the removal of police and those who opposed the removal of police from schools, how they frame their argument and what those arguments might tell us about the possibilities of abolition within schools. A couple key terms or key themes that came out from that research. One is this effort to obscure law enforcement as an arm of anti-Black violence. And what happens in that is there is the reality that police or school police officers are part of this broader institution of policing, but not necessarily connected to anti-Blackness or anti-Black violence. Which there was an obliqueness there that if we're willing to understand that the broader context of police is rooted in anti-Blackness, how then do we not see school police as part of that? And a lot of that came from individual relationships with officers. I had an officer that was good to me. I had an officer that served the community well. I had an officer who high-fived the kids and brought toys around Christmas. So it was this bad apple narrative that was sort of surrounding instead of the broader context of the institution of police, which I think if we obscure the anti-Blackness from the actual violence that police can potentially have in youth in schools, I think that works to disappear how Black folks suffer in schools. Another major idea that came up was sort of this political difference I'm still navigating between liberal and radical approaches to abolition. This really makes me think about a comment that my colleague made earlier around these sort of interim wins that we need to celebrate along the way. And that comes up a lot with sort of the discourses, how we sort of think about a step forward as a win in the direction of abolition. And I'm not convinced yet. In some ways, I think about how celebrating those minor wins, although necessary, might allow us to get stuck. And if those become stopgates, do we ever get to realizing abolitionist dreams? Or do we begin to settle with things? Settle is such a strong word. Or do we begin to just accept things like restorative justice, which again is an important practice, but again, does that get us to the end goal of abolition? So I'm still wrestling with it and trying to figure out how to think about that. In addition to examining the public comments that were made during those school board meetings, I also looked at school district resolutions that were passed around removing law enforcement from school, and one of the things, so I looked at the school board resolutions from across 50 school districts as well, both urban, rural, suburban, in all different contexts. And one of the main outcomes or alternatives that were proposed in those resolutions were restorative justice. It was really this idea that we need to hire more restorative justice personnel or school counselors. So those were sort of the two main alternatives to police, which took me to this sort of third paper. This third idea is really sort of thinking about how educators and school leaders are deputized to function as carceral arms. So if we are just hiring more people under different names to then exercise the same activities of the carceral arm, are we moving toward abolition or are we shifting it? And one of my colleagues on the panel thought about that today, as well as to think about how we're just shifting the modes of carcerality across different personnel. I got the time indicator, so I just want to go to this last slide. I won't be able to go over all these things really quickly, but just to point out a few sort of things I'm thinking with around policy and practice. One, I think about sort of, again, going back to the liberal forms of abolition that are well-intended, but do they get at systems and structures, and will they get us closer to radical abolition? I'm still wrestling with that question. I don't yet have answers, but I think it's worthy for us to pontificate around. There's also a question around a more comprehensive approach to disarm, disempower, and disband law enforcement from schools. School board resolutions, what we've seen, especially in large urban districts, is this rolling back of those resolutions. So, in 2020 saying we're going to cut ties with law enforcement, in 2021 saying we're going to hire a whole lot more. How do we think about the teeth that those resolutions may have? And if they don't, what might a more comprehensive approach be at the district and state level around abolition? Practice, I really think about the way that we train educators, the way that we train school leaders is still rooted in abolitionist ideas and logics. It's rooted in carceral ideas and carceral logics. This idea that we have to remove unruly students, this idea that surveillance is the mechanism to ensure safety and higher academic outcomes. There's overwhelming evidence that says that is not always the case. How do we think about how we are training those who lead our schools? And now that I've been told to wrap it up, on number 4, I just want to also point out that I started the conversation thinking about surveillance, what concerns me now around sort of surveillance is the seductive nature of ed tech companies that are marketing surveillance mechanisms to schools as a way to say, you have this money that you are diverting away from law enforcement, now give it to us, and we can have these sort of invisible forms of surveillance and security. Which, again, if we're thinking about abolition, does moving resources from one mode of surveillance or carcerality to sort of these technologies of surveillance, does that get us to realizing our abolitionist dreams? Thank you.
No. All right, before I begin, I would like to state my charge, which was to we expect the discussants to listen to the presentations with a careful ear towards policy and practice in hopes of steering the Q&A session to practical solutions. And that's all that I was expected to do until Heather got up and, totally changed the tenor of that charge. And that led me scrambling to come up with in an hour, not necessarily PowerPoint, but some sort of coherence in order to make sense of abolition as policy. And I must confess that, I wondered, why did John ask me to be the discussant on abolition? What do I know about abolition? And so, in thinking about this, I went back to Garland 2001 and thinking about mass incarceration and the two features of mass incarceration, which first is the sheer size, which we can think of as the volume or the churning, so that the imprisonment rate is somehow disproportionately and historically out of alignment with what was once the norm, not just for our society, but across societies that look like our own. And then the second feature being concentration effects, such that imprisonment of whole groups of the population becomes possible. And he reminds us that, Durkheim would consider this to be a pathological phenomenon. And it's one in which Louis Quant challenges this characterization or specification of mass and instead favors hyper-incarceration as a more precise designation of what he deems triple selectivity, which I think for this entire symposium really gets at the issue of race, class, and space. And I'd add in gender to that as well as a constitutive property of the phenomenon. And so in thinking about this, confessing I didn't know much about abolition, I turned to one of the writings of my colleague and collaborator, Anjali Verma, in this Oxford Handbook chapter titled Mass Incarceration, Decarceration, and Abolition, Beyond Keywords. And I just want to read part of the passage of that paper. And it says, quote, evoking the legacy of U.S. chattel slavery and transnational movements to end all systems of slavery, abolition was often dismissed within criminology as a radical fringe term, signifying anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-war politics considered threatening to dominant social orders, and namely to the foundation of law and order governance under mass incarceration. Abolition has reanimated in the 21st century lexicon as increasingly potent vocabulary for reimagining public safety, systems of security, and justice, and the role of the state. Whether this new abolitionism features more centrally into criminological canons as a transformative concept, however, remains as open as the question of mass incarceration's abolition, end quote. And for me, that's where I think this panel steps in to take on the various, what I call considerations about abolitionism. And the first consideration involves the sort of theoretical and empirical tenets of abolition. So what is abolition? What are its measurements, operationalizations, and limitations, as well as its limits? Additionally, is abolitionism simply decarcerating jails and prisons? Or does abolitionism mean more than that? So what does abolition mean in the context of home confinement versus jails and prisons? What does it mean in the context of other surveillance and financial punishments? So we've seen the work of various scholars on this panel take up the issues of bail as a financial punishment and as a burden on families and communities, and in particular, Black women and women of color. We've seen from Professor Jenkins' very masterful claiming of additional time that it also means that like surveillance is self-policing, and it reminds me deeply of Foucauldian biopower. In its most efficient form is when we are regulating ourselves and surveilling ourselves and others. And so abolitionism needs to incorporate communities that benefit from and rely on prisons and jails and other systems of surveillance and inequality. Or what the previous panel referred to as carceral capacity, and thinking about upcycling. The third feature, I think, of abolitionism has to focus on the socio-legal and statutory context, which Professor Bell outlined very nicely in terms of thinking about consent decrees, the use of various lawsuits, and others. And I want to also add that in the context of immigration, again, from the earlier panel, immigration blurs these civil and criminal laws in ways that, as I believe Professor Decker pointed out, functions in this sort of shadow carceral state that Catherine Beckett and Naomi Marikawa have written about. But in their writings, they also point to something else, and that is legal hybridity. That is, the different types and forms of law in and of themselves are beginning to be blurred and fused and hybridized in such a way that now entering into or exposure to one particular system may increase your likelihood of exposure to another system that were completely independent systems. And in my work with Angeli Verma, my colleague that I mentioned, we write about legal hybridity in California, and specifically across all 29 California legislative code sections. And we find that these different types of punishments, both financial and also physical, are embedded in both criminal and civil law. And they are fusing in ways that now we're all laying witness to, particularly in the context of reproductive health and women's reproductive health. And I think that Professor Gurusami's work illustrates this very point importantly, because states are currently criminalizing reproductive health in ways that women seeking abortions or women seeking other or trying to make other health decisions, or people who members of the transgender community, and even book burning, right? These are now becoming civil offenses for which not only is the patient the object, but so too are the doctors and the hospitals. And in doing so, it's blurred from once being or now becoming a criminal matter to also being a civil matter. And so these legal hybrids are something that abolitionism needs to contend with in its foundations from the moment of policy construction all the way to policy repeal. And so I want to challenge or offer up to the panelists the opportunity to think about the different forms of abolitionism, how you can, reform or dismantle unequal systems. In California, they currently have the California Racial Justice Act of 2020 as one means to give inmates and prisoners the opportunity to exercise their agency in ways that will bring back their dignity, their democracy, and possibly their liberty. And so I want to challenge you to think about the work in which you're doing and the forms of abolitionism and their limits, their tenets, their specifications, and how we can begin to take existing laws and get them either off the books or reform them. And then also how we can think about what's happening now in the contemporary landscape where various communities are being criminalized, and I don't know if civilized is the word to use to denote civil law, but like the reality is that now these legal hybrids are operating in a way that really isn't shadow. It's really not shadow. It's really out there, and we need to deal with that. Thank you. Ruben? Or Professor Miller?
Thanks. I had two questions. But first, Brian, great job. Great job. And thank you also for reminding me why I love Black people. Anyway, and your question about like the criminal, from criminal to a civil matter, which is also criminal matter in the case of doctors, performing abortions in a bunch of states now. But I have two questions for the panel. One for Faith, but maybe also for the panel too. And I think DeMarcus, you really, or Professor Jenkins, like you moved us in this direction. When you asked the question at the end of your presentation, which is, do these things that I think abolitionists might call reformist reforms or something like that, right? Like the line that you were skirting, lead us to our abolitionist dreams. I think ours is doing a lot of work there, and I want to sort of highlight that. And I think that John is inviting us to do some of that our work when he's taking abolitionism as it's like taking it for granted that it could and should drive policy, that it does drive policy. So it's like abolition and social policy. And so what's the power of presuming abolition is reasonable where others don't? And I don't think this is I don't think the project that you're asking us to engage in is a big tent politics kind of project, the type that folks engage in that say let racism off the hook. You know what I mean? Like it's something very different. It's a radical community politic. But it makes me wonder, what do you need to have in common to work with people who don't share the abolitionist dream to bring about a vision of abolition? And it seems to me that that's all about, like all abolitionists do this, but I wonder like what is that thing? And then for Faith, and this is one question for Faith, but also maybe it's a question for the panelists. I'm thinking about bail reform that's passed in Illinois. I'm like Chicago, all day Chicago. So it's near and dear to my heart. And I'm thinking about a young brother who is now not gonna get out of jail because there's no bail set, and it allows for judicial discretion that didn't used to be there. And this seems to be the move for any sort of progressive moment. And I don't know if it's backlash or if it's just the ways that punishment operates, how it takes up space in the new reality or something like that. But every move to make a thing better leads to like something else. And does that mean it's not worth engaging in? Is a question. So and that's one of my questions around the work of abolition and the quote non-reform is reform, like the challenge to that is, well, everything worth doing, leads to something else. And the something else is often taken on. Anything once institutionalized is institutionalized. So anyway, I'm talking too long, but those are my 2 questions.
Maybe, yeah. I feel like I do not have a perfect answer because I struggle with that too. And I think like the first example that came to mind from my research is that with in Harris County, they were also doing reform when I was interning in commercial bail agencies. And basically, defendants were being let out for free or no charge if they had a misdemeanor offense. And the bail agents would say, we hate this, right? Because they let them out for free, something happens, they get rearrested, and now the bond gets set way higher than it would have originally done, right? So you're almost being penalized for not taking advantage of your free get out of jail card, right? So now it's even harder for you to meet that bar or meet a commercial bail agency. And so for them, they're like, it doesn't really change anything. It's just, it's delayed re-entrenchment, right? You still end up in the system. And so I don't want to think that means give up on reform, right, to stop. But I hear you. That's a part of the conversation that has to be had, that backlash occurs, right, when we do make these incremental steps. So I don't know.
I think if I can just maybe chime to think through some things as well. Your question made me think about sort of where Du Bois and Angela Davis depart in their ideology. And one of their core points of departure is around the role of the state. If the state is an apparatus through which abolition can be achieved, or do we sort of, I don't want to say buck the system, but do we not engage the state in that process of abolition? I still wrestle with that, right? So I'm not sure if I'm Team Du Bois or Team Davis on that, or at least earlier Davis. Her philosophy changed over time. But I think that becomes part of the question for me. I think the other piece, too, is sort of when I think about like abolition and its core goal to reduce harm, and this idea of how do we celebrate, appreciate, acknowledge these wins along the way, it's hard for me to tally those as wins. Because for me, all they do is shift the capacity to reproduce harm, and they don't destroy that capacity. So if we are, we're moving away from police, but now we're increasing surveillance, well, I don't know if we've necessarily gotten to a place where we have begun to destroy the capacity to reproduce harm. And I think in order to sort of move toward abolition, the core question for me that fundamentally starts the conversation is, do we believe that we can live in a world where harm does not exist? Right? So if we can think that harm can be completely eradicated. If we think that, then I think that gets us to different ways of saying, nah, that's just another form of harm. Nah, that just opens the door for another reproduction of harm. And I think that, for me, that makes it more difficult to say, well, yeah, we got to win here, but there's still this harm that's being done. So, I don't have a complete answer to your question, but I think for me, part of it is like it becomes sort of this idea of, can a world exist without harm in that way, and harm generally, right? And if it can, what do we need to do to get there? And is getting there just sort of shifting who has the capacity to inflict harm?
All right, we only have time for 1 or 2 more questions, so I'm just going to ask that you all ask your questions, and then we'll give the panelists 30 seconds to respond.
I'm going to make a case quickly for comparative study. One is that, Professor Jenkins, I'm wondering if when we think about police in schools, white schools tend to think of the police as in service of students and in service of teachers. So for instance, there's a school fight, teacher's like, I'm not breaking that up, officer. or they feel like they're gonna protect the school from a school shooting, et cetera. And obviously in Black schools, it's about surveillance, it's about, right, other things. And so it allows us to see what Professor Friedman would call racist intent. And I'm just want to put that out there. The same for faith. I was thinking, when you go to see bond court, and I think it's worth a comparative study here, they make the family stand up. It's always women, and the public defenders will say, if you see those, if you stand up, then they'll set a fair bail or bond. But they make them, and that criminalizes the women too. They stand up like they're in attendance of the court. Now they just eradicated that bond, but again, the 10%. If it's 10% of $5,000, you can't. That's the rent. Like you can't. That's you can't. And who does it? Women. So that I didn't realize the women's league were part of that, but I'm gonna press and say comparatively, it might distill the uniqueness of the commercial bond versus the state version.
Okay.
It's like saying for-profit prisons are worse than state prisons. It's different in kind, but
Right.
very similar in its role. So I'm just putting that out. And I
Yeah,
feel
thank
like
you.
someone else had-
Heather.
Heather?
Thank you so much for this really great panel. John, I think I finally understand why we're all in this room. As he knows, I sort of pushed him on this abolition, abolition as policy and what we should be thinking about here. But I think this panel really brought it together for me. And it does, I think, come down to this question, DeMarcus, about whether and how we engage the state, right? And there's a real tension, I think, that was brought up between Faith and Cecila's papers. And that is to say that as Cecilia sort of rightly, is outraged by this practice in California, and then looking ahead to, what does abolition look like? Abolition looks like the community doing these things for people, right? But then when you think back to what Faith told us, right, this then puts potentially sort of, we could think of it as an unfair burden on the community and the families. And why is that the case? Because Monica tells us that there is legal estrangement, but that these state institutions have not historically and continue to not involve the people that they need to involve, particularly poor people of color, but also, wider than that, right? It comes back to this question of democracy. And so are we not engaging the state because the state, hasn't engaged with us historically, right? And so, I'm interested in hearing you kind of think about that tension there. Thank you.
In 30 seconds.
if I might. So I think for me, one of the keys for this is really thinking about Angela Davis and her co-authors, their book, Abolition, Feminism Now, where they say abolition feminism is about the both and. So I think it's not about saying, we only rely on the community, we only rely on folks in their own networks and resources, or we only look to negotiate with the state. I think we have to do both, and abolition is about really thinking about the hybridity of strategies, of moments, of methods, and that we're all going to serve different purposes, and that there's something productive about the tension and about the fact that we disagree about the methods and moments. And I think precisely all of us in this room, the fact that we're coming at this from different angles and problematizing these different strategies, it requires everything. An abolitionist imagination requires all of us to engage in that work, because the white supremacist imagination is also pretty extensive. And so we need everybody to really be involved in thinking about that unmaking.
And I know we're pressed for time, but I don't know if this is what you meant by process, but what comes to mind in my case is, not always, but family members do want to help. They do want to show up. They don't want their loved one in jail. I would say what is so amazing about interviews and ethnography is unwinding that process that makes it punitive for families, right? It's the coercion that bail agents do. It's the manipulating their emotions. It's making them subjects of surveillance and carceral control, right? And so, that's what we have to eliminate. And then perhaps maybe it becomes less toxic and less harmful for families
to engage.
Monica, you get last word.
Okay, great. I was hoping I got to say something. This is such a rich questions. But one, Ruben asked the question about like what is the baseline for working with people who don't share the same abolitionist vision. For me, it's how seriously are they taking the humanity of the marginalized people with which we're working with. Like, and one of the things I've unfortunately seen is people who I think share my politics, who don't take the humanity of people seriously. But that, for me, is the baseline more so than the ostensible politics. Number two, very quickly, you asked about how do we celebrate the wins? And I just want to be very clear, like the ostensible wins. I think we need to be clear that celebration is not it. Like, I mean, so, like, I think, one of my students said one time, like, I think on the left we need, more strategists, like, we need more organizers, but we also need strategists. And I think that's, for me, what's really important, is how do we see things that might not really totally align with an abolitionist vision as part of a longer term strategy, and that requires us to drill more deeply. It's not like, oh, is it a reformist win? It's like, what kind of win? What is the specific policy? Like, so some policies would be off the table. That's why I think the language of liberal form of abolition doesn't totally make sense, because the very idea of abolition rejects some of these kind of like, as Brian was inviting us to think about. So anyway, I'm going to stop talking because we're totally out of time. But thank you. This is really productive.